In a world where the media thrives on controversy and power is constantly challenged, one moment can silence an entire room. During an exclusive international interview, a self-important journalist thought he could catch the Pope off guard with a series of bold, borderline disrespectful questions. But what followed left the world speechless. This is the story of how Pope Leo XIV, calm, wise and unshakable, taught a lesson no microphone could contain. The Vatican press hall was bathed in an almost otherworldly glow. Golden light streamed through stained glass windows, casting solemn patterns on the marble floor. It was a rare occasion, an event whispered about in international circles for weeks. Pope Leo XIV, a leader known for his humility, razor-sharp intellect, and spiritual depth, had agreed to give an exclusive live interview. Only a handful of journalists from around the globe had been handpicked to attend. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, tension, and something else: ambition. At the far end of the room, seated beneath a modest crucifix, Pope Leo XIV waited in silence. His white robes seemed to defy the lights above, absorbing none of their glare. His eyes were calm, but alert, like those of someone who had seen centuries pass through souls, not calendars. Surrounding him were cardinals, aides, and security personnel, but he sat alone on the stage. Alone, but not vulnerable. He had the air of someone who carried history in his breath. Among the journalists sat Daniel Cross, a man whose career had been built on spectacle and confrontation. He wasn't the kind to take notes quietly or ask rehearsed questions. No. Daniel was the type who craved disruption, who saw interviews not as conversations, but as battlegrounds. His face was familiar to millions: sharp jawline, perfectly styled hair, and a smirk that rarely faded. Known for making politicians sweat and CEOs fumble, he was dubbed the Interrogator by his network. A man who believed no one was untouchable, especially not men in robes. Daniel had lobbied aggressively to be selected for this event. He wasn't Catholic. In fact, he had little interest in religion, except where it intersected with power, politics, and controversy. To him, the church was an institution frozen in time, rich with contradictions and ripe for challenge. He saw the Pope not as a spiritual shepherd, but as another powerful figure who needed to be exposed. His contradictions unveiled, his beliefs put under the scalpel of modern scrutiny. As the cameras began to roll, Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, his hands already resting confidently on his lap. His earpiece buzzed faintly with the voice of his producer. "Keep it sharp, Daniel. Make it trend." He didn't need the reminder. He had already planned his opening blow. Something bold. Something that would put the Pope on the defensive. Something tweetable. Around him, the other journalists adjusted their notes, cleared their throats, or sat reverently. Some were visibly nervous. This wasn't just a press event. It was spiritual theatre. The Pope didn't do these things often, and when he did, people remembered. But Daniel wasn't here to remember. He was here to interrupt, to challenge, to dominate. In his mind, he wasn't walking into a cathedral of holiness. He was entering a colosseum, and the lion didn't scare him. A signal flashed. The interview had begun. The moderator made a brief introduction in 5 languages, reminding the world that this was an unprecedented moment of transparency. The Holy Father would now answer select questions from the world's press. And then it happened. Daniel was called up first. He rose slowly, theatrically. Every movement was intentional. The camera followed him as he approached the microphone stand set only a few meters away from the Pope. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stood, eyes locked on the pontiff, ready to strike. Pope Leo XIV looked at him with a quiet curiosity. Not judgment, not fear, just curiosity. Like a grandfather listening to a teenager explain the internet. Daniel cleared his throat, paused for effect, and opened his mouth. He had no idea what storm he was about to walk into. Daniel Cross stood at the microphone with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. The moment had arrived. The spotlight was his, and so was the silence. Cameras zoomed in. Social media feeds around the world lit up as the broadcast streamed live. The Vatican's marble halls, ancient and echoing with centuries of reverence, seemed to brace themselves. He didn't look down at his notes. He didn't need to. His question had been memorized, sharpened like a blade, crafted to cut through sacred robes and holy reputations. His voice, confident and calculated, rang through the chamber. Your Holiness, isn't the Catholic Church just an outdated institution? A relic of the past, clinging to rituals and doctrines that no longer serve a world defined by science, progress and reason. There it was, the opening shot, echoing louder than the bells of St. Peter's Basilica. A direct challenge not just to the Pope, but to the entire weight of Christian tradition. Some journalists looked stunned. Others leaned forward. Even a few cardinals visibly shifted in their seats. A few younger staffers, unaccustomed to such directness, inhaled sharply. Daniel held his gaze. His expression was neutral, but inside, adrenaline surged. This was the question that would go viral. He imagined the headlines, "Journalist confronts the Pope with truth." He didn't want diplomacy. He wanted friction. He wanted Leo XIV to squirm. But the Pope didn't blink. He didn't sigh. He didn't lean back in insult or lean forward in defensiveness. Instead, he smiled. Not the kind of smile meant for photos or diplomacy, but a subtle, knowing smile. The kind a teacher gives when a student thinks they have discovered something new, unaware it's already been covered centuries ago. Then in a calm, grounded voice that seemed to quiet even the creaking of the cathedral floor, Pope Leo XIV responded, "If love, humility and service are outdated, then yes, we are hopelessly ancient." A pause, long enough for the weight of the words to settle. But if the world still yearns for compassion, for purpose, and for the sacred value of human dignity, then perhaps it is not the church that is outdated, but the question itself. The room was stunned. Even Daniel's confident posture shifted slightly, his fingers tightening on the mic. He hadn't expected that. He was prepared for evasion, maybe even frustration. But this, a turning of the question into something deeper, something disarming. The Pope continued, still composed. Progress without roots becomes chaos. Technology without wisdom becomes a weapon. And freedom without truth becomes loneliness. We may wear robes and speak of mysteries, but the truths we guard are not ours. They are the inheritance of every soul. Cameras captured Daniel's face, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, his eyes darting for a brief second, calculating a comeback. But the Pope was not done. Do you know, Mr. Cross, what the word tradition truly means? He asked gently. It is not the worship of ashes. It is the preservation of fire. A murmur passed through the room. Several journalists glanced at each other. It was clear this was not a man who needed to defend himself. This was a man who had nothing to prove. Daniel stepped forward slightly, raising his voice with a hint of defiance. But don't you think it's dangerous to hold on to ancient beliefs in a world that's constantly changing? Isn't it time to let go? The Pope tilted his head, reflective. We live in a world that updates its devices every year, and yet the human heart still breaks in the same way it did 2,000 years ago. People still long for love. They still suffer. They still search for meaning. You see change, Mr. Cross. I see repetition. But through repetition, we are reminded of what matters most. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of reverence, of surprise, of awe. Daniel wasn't done yet, but for the first time, he realised he wasn't in control. The man he thought he could rattle had just turned his attack into an invitation for reflection. The Pope wasn't playing defence. He was already 3 moves ahead. The tension in the room hadn't broken, it had evolved. What began as an attempted ambush was slowly turning into something far more profound. The cameras continued to roll, but now with a different energy. Viewers across the world weren't watching a confrontation anymore. They were watching a revelation unfold. And Daniel Cross, for all his calculated bravado, was beginning to sense the shift. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender the spotlight. He was known for pushing boundaries, and if the first question didn't destabilise the Pope, perhaps the next one would. He scanned his internal arsenal for something more personal, more scathing, something that would force a real reaction. He decided to bring history into the room. Not the ancient kind that dignifies statues and hymns, but the dark, painful kind. The kind that lingers in headlines and hearts. He cleared his throat, lowered his voice just enough to seem serious, and asked, "Your Holiness, how can anyone trust the Church when it has such a long history of corruption, abuse, and failure? You speak of compassion, but what about the victims? What about the cover-ups? Why should people believe you are any different?" The words were carefully chosen, measured to wound, delivered like a legal indictment. The room froze. A cardinal at the edge of the stage closed his eyes. An aide shifted nervously, glancing toward the control booth. There it was. The trap question, the kind that, if answered poorly, could detonate a PR nightmare. But it wasn't just about optics. It was moral. It was real, painful, unavoidable. The Pope didn't rush. He didn't fumble through a prepared statement. Instead, he sat with the silence, letting the weight of the question settle into the marble and gold. His expression changed, just slightly. Not defensiveness, not shame, but sorrow. The kind of sorrow that doesn't come from image management, but from carrying centuries of human imperfection on one's back. When he spoke, his voice was softer, but unwavering. "You are right to ask that question, Mr. Cross," he began. "And you are right to feel anger. There are no words that can undo the suffering caused by those who betrayed the trust given to them, not just as priests, but as human beings." There was no denial, no sidestepping. Evil hides best in sacred places, he continued, looking directly at Daniel, because people trust just what is holy, and that trust has been broken by our own hands. There is no excuse. There is only repentance and the unrelenting work of healing. Daniel blinked. That wasn't what he expected. The Pope leaned slightly forward, narrowing the distance between them, not with intimidation, but intimacy. "I do not defend the sins of this institution," he said, "but I do believe in its capacity to change, not through words, but through action, and we have much to answer for, still do, every day." Daniel opened his mouth, perhaps to interject, but the Pope wasn't finished. "But let me ask you something, Mr. Cross. When a doctor commits malpractice, do you abandon medicine? When a judge takes a bribe, do you renounce justice? When a journalist lies, do you stop believing in the power of truth?" The room held its breath. It was a rhetorical reversal, but not in arrogance. It was surgical. Daniel's jaw tensed slightly, but his face remained composed. Pope Leo XIV continued, "There is a difference between the message and the messenger. And the tragedy of the Church's failures is not that we were exposed. It's that we allowed the message to be hidden beneath our failures. But the gospel, mercy, sacrifice, love of neighbour, that message is not ours to distort. It remains pure even when we are not." For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no flash of camera bulbs, just a deep, collective stillness. Daniel felt it, even if he didn't show it. The trap had sprung, but not on its intended target. Instead, it revealed something unexpected. A man unafraid of owning the sins of his office, because he did not see himself as above the people, but as accountable to them. And then the Pope added one final line, quiet but sharp. "Perhaps, Mr. Cross, the question is not why people should trust the Church. The question is, what are we willing to do to be worthy of that trust again?" It wasn't a dodge. It wasn't a PR spin. It was a challenge. A confession wrapped in resolve. And for the first time in the entire interview, Daniel didn't have a follow-up. He stood at the microphone silent. His posture hadn't changed. His expression remained firm. But something beneath his well-rehearsed armour had been pierced, not humiliated, just humanised. The cameras kept recording. Around the world, people leaned closer to their screens, not because of scandal, but because something rare was happening. Truth was speaking to power, and power, for once, was listening. The air in the Vatican press hall had taken on a strange, electric stillness, like the pauses between the toll of great cathedral bells. Each of Daniel Cross's previous strikes had been met not with defensiveness, nor anger, but with something far more unsettling, unwavering clarity. Pope Leo XIV had answered every challenge without flinching, without faltering, and without resorting to the weapons most world leaders rely on: deflection, blame, or scripted charm. He had responded with something rarer and infinitely more disarming: truth, humility, and conviction. But Daniel wasn't finished. The last exchange had rattled something inside him, but ego is not so easily unseated. He had built a career on pressure, and this was his most watched moment. Millions were tuning in live, and millions more would see it in clips, edits, and commentary by morning. He had to regain control. He had to push harder. If logic wouldn't unravel the Pope, perhaps accusation would. Something personal. Something that couldn't be softened by ancient wisdom or spiritual metaphors. He stepped slightly closer to the mic, voice now sharpened with a subtle sneer. "Isn't it true, Your Holiness," he began slowly, "that you are still just another powerful man, another leader behind closed doors, guarded by gold gates and tradition, telling others how to live while you remain untouched by the consequences?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a poisoned fog. "You speak of humility, yet you sit on a throne. You speak of sacrifice, yet you wear silk robes and live in palaces. Isn't that hypocrisy?" A few audible gasps echoed through the chamber. Even the other journalists shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just the question, it was the tone. Sharp, accusatory, borderline contemptuous. There was a line between challenge and insult, and Daniel had just leapt across it with both feet. And yet, Pope Leo XIV did not raise a brow. He did not recoil in insult, nor rise to meet the aggression with scolding. Instead, he simply stood. He rose slowly from his chair, not with the authority of a king, but with the quiet strength of a man who knows exactly who he is. The camera operators instinctively zoomed in. His posture was straight, not rigid. His eyes locked onto Daniel's with unshakable steadiness. And when he spoke, his voice carried not just through the room, but into the silence between heartbeats. "Let me tell you something about thrones, Mr. Cross." He walked toward the edge of the stage, just a few steps closer. Not to intimidate, but to connect. There is no throne in this world heavier than the one built by expectation, by grief, by responsibility, and yes, by the sins of others which you must answer for, whether you committed them or not. He stopped, folding his hands in front of him. "Do you think I do not feel the burden of this robe?" he asked, gesturing to the simple white garment he wore. "It is not silk that weighs it down. It is the prayers of the desperate, the secrets of the dying, the forgiveness begged for by men who fear there is none left for them. That is what I wear." The room was silent, but not still. Something was stirring. Daniel's expression faltered, only slightly. "You speak of palaces. I sleep in a room smaller than the studio that airs your show," the Pope said with a faint smile, one tinge with irony rather than condescension. "I eat the same meals as the gardeners. I walk the same halls as janitors. The power you speak of is a shadow cast by something much brighter than me, and it terrifies me every single day." He took another step forward, his voice softening. "Because I know what power does to men. I have seen it corrupt saints, and I have seen it destroy nations. That is why I pray. Not because I am holy, Mr. Cross, but because I am afraid of what I might become without grace." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. His next question faltered somewhere between his lungs and his lips. The Pope continued, "Do you think I tell others how to live because I believe I know better?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I offer guidance because I have seen what happens when people are left alone with their pain and their pride. They turn their loneliness into anger, their hunger into cruelty, their sorrow into addiction. I don't sit here to rule over anyone. I sit here so that someone, somewhere, still hears a whisper in the chaos saying, "You are not alone. You are still loved." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Daniel stared at him. The man he had tried to provoke wasn't fighting back. He was laying himself bare. With every word, the line between arrogance and authority blurred, and Daniel was losing his footing. Not publicly, his posture remained erect, his hand still on the mic, but inside, something was shifting. A wall had been hit, not by force, by truth. Pope Leo XIV then said something that pierced through the theatre of it all. "Mr. Cross, I am not playing God. I'm begging him for mercy. Every day. For myself. For this world. For you." A pause. Then, "And I hope you do too." No applause followed. No chants. No cues. Just stillness. Reverence. As if the centuries themselves were holding their breath. Daniel lowered the microphone. His eyes didn't move. He wasn't defeated, but he was no longer attacking. He had come for a battle of egos. He had found something else entirely. Daniel Cross stood at the microphone, still and silent. For the first time in his decorated, controversial career, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of something far more foreign to him: doubt. Not in his talent, nor in his platform, but in his motives, in his methods. He had come into this interview to strip power from a symbol, to rattle a man who wore holiness like a uniform. But what he found instead was a man who wore vulnerability like armour, and it was invincible. The room waited, heavy with silence. Somewhere, cameras continued to roll, broadcasting this moment to millions, but it no longer felt like a spectacle. It felt like a pause in the world's noise. And it was Daniel who now had the floor, if only he could figure out what to say with it. He leaned into the mic again, but this time there was no smirk, no superiority, just a question that came out softer than he intended. "What if?" he began, and then stopped. He looked directly at the Pope, his voice unsteady. "What if you're wrong?" There it was, not an attack, not a setup, a real question, simple, human, afraid. It wasn't about institutions, or theology, or global influence. It was the kind of question that slips into the mind in the middle of the night when no one else is awake to hear it. What if everything you believe in is just a story? The room didn't gasp this time. There was no need. Everyone knew what this moment was. The final stand, not of Daniel, but of the ego. And it wasn't met with fire or fury. It was met with silence. Pope Leo XIV stood motionless for a beat, his eyes never leaving Daniel's, but they were no longer the eyes of a leader fielding a challenge. They were the eyes of a man who had lived that very question, for decades, maybe for a lifetime. Then in a voice quieter than before, yet somehow more powerful, he replied, "Then may God forgive me." Another pause. The words were simple, unflinching, not theatrical, truthful. "But," he continued, stepping forward just a little, "if I'm right, may he forgive you." The words did not land like a threat. They landed like a door closing behind a shadow. Quiet, final, immense. The silence that followed was different than all the others, not expectant, not dramatic. It was the kind of silence that only comes when something sacred has just been said, and no one dares trample it with noise. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. The answer had not just been heard, it had been felt. The question he asked had boomeranged back at him, but instead of wounding him, it awakened something. A flicker of discomfort, yes, but also awe, maybe even wonder. Around the room, journalists sat frozen, unsure whether to look at the Pope, at Daniel, or down at their own hands. One camera operator wiped his eyes discreetly, unsure why tears had found him. The moderator at the side of the room didn't move to end the interview. No one did. No one could. Pope Leo XIV didn't press the moment. He simply turned, walked slowly back to his seat, and sat, his hands folded, his expression peaceful. It was not a victory lap. It was a return to stillness. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The usual power dynamics of an interview, the need to win, to score points, to dominate, collapsed entirely. What remained was a conversation that had travelled beyond debate and into the heart of something much older, much deeper than television, or politics or controversy. It was the rarest kind of truth, the kind that didn't need to be proven, only witnessed. Daniel finally stepped away from the microphone. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. But something in his walk had changed. It wasn't submission. It wasn't defeat. It was something closer to respect, perhaps even reverence. And perhaps, though he would never say it aloud, a seed of belief had been planted. Not belief in dogma or doctrine, but in the mystery that maybe, just maybe, there was something more. As he returned to his seat, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked down, fingers loosely clasped together, absorbing something he couldn't yet name. Later, when the world dissected the interview, headlines would vary. Pope dismantles media bully with grace. Leo XIV silences journalist with one sentence. Faith meets fire and doesn't burn. But none of them captured what actually happened in that room. Because what had happened wasn't about one man silencing another. It was about silence itself doing what no argument ever could, revealing truth not through volume, but through presence. And in the quiet that followed, the world listened.